Frostquake is a word that I came across in a science book, which seemed to be a more appropriate title for a book than the T.S. Eliot quote. And the definition of a frostquake is a seismic event caused by a sudden cracking action in frozen soil. And that definition appealed to me because it summed up exactly what I was discovering about this winter, which was that beneath the frozen surface, rumblings were taking place, that as the frost began to melt, caused a convulsion which changed things politically, culturally, sexually, socially. So that's what that is. But maybe I should speak a bit about, should I say a little bit about what the winter was in terms of the weather, why it's a significant winter?
Tell us, That's a good place to start.
Shall I?
Yes.
I mean, what happened was in December 1962, there had been the last of the great London smogs, the smogs that Dickens used to write about. And in fact, there were people still alive who remembered those Dickensian smogs. And they were so thick and so polluted and so yellow, largely to do with the uninhibited use of coal fire burning in cities. And London was particularly dense because there were a particular number of coal fires burning then before the Clean Air Act was passed, in fact, that year, 1962. And it was not unusual at all to see people walking around in the street with masks on their faces. And the smog itself, because of the damage it did to lungs, killed several thousands of people that winter. And so Londoners and other city dwellers were just getting over this particularly bad weather in early December 1962, looking forward to their Christmases. They had a lovely Christmas. And then just on Boxing Day, just when a lot of people were getting over their turkey, getting ready to leave and go home again after the Christmas break, that evening, a huge cold front swept in from Siberia right across Europe, causing havoc in Greece, in Germany, in France, in Spain, and making its way across the channel to us. And on Boxing Day night, I remember we had a party at Sissinghurst, where we had just gone to live because my grandmother had died earlier in the year and had left her house at Sissinghurst to my dad. And we had moved in there for our first Christmas. And that night we had a little party for the villagers. And as we locked the great big barn door that used to be the stable door for the horses at Sissinghurst, we walked out onto the lawn, and to my 8-year-old thrildom and my 5-year-old brother's ecstasy, Adam, it was snowing. And of course, when you're 8 and 5, it is all you hope for during your Christmas holidays after you've had the presents. And the snow fell, and the following morning when we opened our curtains, the snow was still falling and transforming the garden at Sissinghurst and cloaking all the statues and the hedges. And this unrecognizable playground was suddenly laid out in front of us. And this snow was falling not only in the Weald of Kent, where I was, or in Sussex, in Berwick, in Lewes, in Alfriston, but up and down the country. And the snow barely stopped falling for 10 weeks solidly. And when there was a respite from the snow, it froze, because it was also the coldest winter for 200 years. And snow and ice immediately have a catastrophic effect on the infrastructure of the transport system of the country. So everything is affected. So Gatwick was closed down. Trains stopped running because of the icy tracks. The RAC said that cars were skipping about as if they were on roller skates on the roads. Huge winds started to billow and blow the snow into these vast drifts of sort of several men high. Animals were finding it increasingly difficult to find food. People were warned that if they'd got their shopping, they should avoid New Forest ponies who were turning feral. Foxes were hunting in pairs, hunting cats to eat. So all the cats had to be kept inside. Sheep were turning cannibalistic. Birds were flying through the air and suddenly hit a freezing gust and would plummet down dead there in that one freezing gust. The sea started to freeze. At Herne Bay in Kent, it was frozen for a mile out. You could walk a mile over the frozen waves, dodging through the frozen wings of the seagulls that had been caught in the movement of the sea as it froze. Lorries could not deliver, so there was food was shelves were empty in shops. Farmers' collection lorries for their milk couldn't reach the collection points. And so at Mark Cross, I read in the Times, there was this wonderful report of this sort of yellowing of all the fields around Mark Cross in Sussex, because the creamy milk, the delicious creamy milk of the farms of Mark Cross had primrosed the white snow and made this crazy yellow blanket all over it. So for human beings and for the animal kingdom, it was a dramatic season. For children, it was amazing.
And one of the delights of the book is you managed to shift focus repeatedly between the overwhelming terribleness of the weather and the individual experiences, and especially for the children enjoying themselves, going out skating, skiing, tobogganing, and not aware of all of the drama going on around them.
Yes, well, you know, children, I mean, the opportunity to not go to school if you couldn't get there, and if the pipes had burst, and school wasn't functioning, what do? You know, you just open up Raymond Briggs's life and revel in snowmen. And Michael Ann at Drusilla's told me some wonderful, wonderful stories about what went on there. I mean, he was not a child. He was a very young man at the time. And he and his brother got their father's skates, pre-war skates, out from the attic, skis, sorry, and skied down. There was a terrific run at the Wilmington Man all the way down the hill. They had to put their kangaroo at Drusilla's at the zoo. The kangaroo was lent the staff sitting room for the winter because there wasn't a big enough place to keep him in. So if you look through the window, you would see Joey reclining on the sofa in the staff sitting room. But yes, I mean, there was huge fun to be had of it. if you had the time, if you were a child, if you were an adult, this winter came on top of a serious sort of political and international situation that was still very much on people's minds, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had taken place in October of '62, and when the threat of a Russian atom bomb being dropped upon us was as real as it could be. Don't forget, we're really only 15 or 17 so years after the ending of the Second World War. And for that generation who had lived through the Second World War, very, very many of them had also lived through a First World War. And so the prospect of a Third World War did not seem so crazy. It felt terrifyingly real. And there were sort of the ramifications of the Cold War were hovering all the way through that cold winter. Across the Atlantic, Jack Kennedy, this young, glamorous fixer of international diplomacy through having dealt with Khrushchev and diffused the threat of the Cuban Missile Crisis, was something that we were looking at for hope and leadership. Our own Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, felt he who had fought in 2 world wars himself, he who wore +4s, shot grouse at weekends, went to stay at Chatsworth, was an old Etonian, had a sort of droopy moustache, felt a little over. He was running a Conservative government that had been in position for 12 years. And so there was this sense of shifting and moving and fear and threat and quite what was going to happen next and who was going to lead us through it.
There's an extraordinary feeling that you've managed to imbue the book that connects the highly personal experiences with the political ramifications and the way the weather touches everybody, whether they're famous and determining the future of the country, or whether they're an isolated farmer trying to make their way through this extraordinarily bad weather. But I had a lot of respect for the way you managed to make clear the human experience and the human side of events that seemed overwhelming, and whether that was the Beatles breaking into the social scene and completely changing the musical outlook, or whether it was the Profumo scandal and the politics at the very top of the country suddenly coming up against a new norm. And I was fascinated that you managed to balance all of these different kind of focus points through the book.
Well, it was a winter in which an enormous amount of stuff was beginning to happen. You mentioned some of it, the Profumo crisis. We were also trying and failing to join the EU, the EEC, the European Community. There was, as I say, this whole international crisis with Cuba and with the sort of whole Russian intimidation. And at home, there was this scandal of a government minister who was rumored to have had an affair with a young model. She was 19, Christine Keeler, who was also sleeping with a Russian spy. And had she passed on secrets between one of Harold Macmillan's political ministers, to the Russians, this was the rumor, but it wasn't published in the newspapers because the fear of libel was so powerful in the context of this old boys network, what was called the establishment, that was so rooted and so self-supporting that it kind of had a stranglehold on truth-telling. One of the things that it's really important during the winter was television. And just in December 62, a program called That Was the Week That Was started broadcasting on Saturday nights. And it was run by this young group of satirists and presented by a 23-year-old David Frost, quite appropriate for the time of year. And these were the satirists for whom nothing in the establishment was going to be exempt from attack, whether it was the monarchy, the church, or politics, particularly politics. And every Saturday, this program went out in front of a live audience, attracting 12 million viewers every single Saturday, where they just laid into with the most sort of brilliant, subversive humor, a completely extraordinary thing for the BBC itself to have allowed to go ahead. It only lasted 1 year. But during that 1 year, every Saturday, this was completely compulsive viewing for everybody, whoever you were, from whatever background, whatever part of the country, you were watching that. And so its power to insinuate and suggest that all was not as it seemed in the British political establishment was could not be overestimated. It came also on top of a magazine, Private Eye, that had also just begun with the same sort of group of people. One of the people I interviewed for the book was Barry Humphries. Barry, are you there? I think he might even be with us tonight, Barry and Lizzie. Anyway, if you are, hi. And Barry's very, very much, there you are.
Yeah, here he is.
And I sat with Barry for hours and hours talking about this extraordinary period in which Barry himself, who had not that long ago arrived from Australia to try to make his way in the clubs and theatres of London, and was digging around in the back of his sofa for some old threepence with which to help to contribute to pay the rent. And not doing too well, and did get a little lucky break in Peter Cook's club at the establishment. He'd met Peter Cook, who was the sort of the king satirist of them all. He'd met him in a pub and they'd got friendly. And Barry had an act with this woman from Melbourne in her apron called Mrs. Everidge. And Barry tried this out at the cynically named Establishment Club, in which Barry's entire audience of about 6, probably, critics, all started to snore and fall off their chairs. It's true, isn't it? So it was invaluable to talk to Barry about these very early days of the satirical movement and the power and influence that they had in beginning to unravel and de-establish the establishment. So that program, TW3, and then also there was another program on Saturday night which had this very massive influence, particularly to all those people who were stuck inside, unable to go out because of the snow, which was called Thank You, Lucky Stars. And this was a music program that featured pop records, not only the sort of semi-established singers like Cliff Richard and Adam Faith, who were, safe and all right. But this gang of 4 from Liverpool, 4 friends who had been hurtling round the country in their clapped out old purple van with the windscreen blowing out in the sort of great freezing gusts of the Pennine Hills, and lying down on top of each other on their drum kit, this unknown band of 4 friends called John, Paul, George and Ringo, who'd got together and were going round the sort of clubs of the North with the pop star of the day, who was called Helen Shapiro, who was a 16-year-old singer who'd gone to #1 with Walking Back to Happiness was her song. And she'd invited the Beatles to join her. They were #5 on the billing order during her tour of these clubs. And gradually the applause for Helly, as they called her, Helly Shapiro, the applause for Helly began to recede. And the screams and shouts and hysteria for this irreverent foursome who joshed about and smoked cigarettes and passed chicken sandwiches and sang like nobody else had ever sung. These wonderful, joyful, completely post-war liberated songs of love and happiness and laughter. And I perhaps I'm sort of giving the game away, which is by saying that by the time the winter of '63 came to an end in March, and the snow had stopped falling and the frost had stopped laying on the ground, this record that they'd been touring with, Please, Please Me, went to #1. And this was a group nobody'd heard of on Boxing Day when those first flakes had begun to fall. So it was a winter in which this exuberance and youth in music, in fashion, a young woman in the King's Road who had a shop called Bazaar. Her name was Mary Quant, was raising skirts for girls. They were creeping higher and higher above the knees because it was so much more practical to run for a bus, to dance, to rush about your office in a shorter skirt, but it was so cold. And so Mary Quant remembered the tights that she'd worn when she was doing her dancing classes when she was a little girl. And so tights suddenly became the thing to wear under these mini skirts.
The description of the way the clothing changed not only how people were seen, but also what they could do was a remarkable dissection of a piece of social history that we don't usually think about. I would like to take a moment to invite everybody who's watching. If you'd like to share any questions you might have through the chat function with me, I'll be planning to relay them to Juliet. But Juliet, I would also like to ask you, you took the decision to make the book not only a social history, but also a memoir. And I think that was a remarkable continuation, because you're talking about big history as well as small focus history, and then you're talking about yourself as well. And it adds a humanity to the story. And your memoir of your family is terrific. But I wonder, was it a brave decision? Was it natural? Had you planned it from the beginning?
I'm not sure if I'd planned it, but it's odd actually, as you wouldn't know, Nash, you wouldn't know this, but as you get older, this extraordinary bonus kind of presents itself to you, which is the vividness with which you remember really, really early periods of your life. And as I was saying when we first started talking, this was a significant winter for me because, first of all, we had gone to live in this tumble down, well, it's called a castle, but it's hardly a castle. And my grandmother would wake up with a there was a hole in the roof above her ceiling, and she once woke up one winter to find that she got a sort of entire duvet of snow lying on top of her. You know, it wasn't a grand place, but it was a phenomenally romantic Elizabethan chateau, really, rather than a castle that had kind of crumbled away, and most of it had disappeared, and it left a few buildings dotted around this beautiful garden that my grandmother made, and at the heart of it, this Elizabethan hunting tower. And when my grandmother Vita died in June 62, she left the place to my dad, and we moved there. We were at school. My brother and I were at school in London. We lived in London, but we would come to Sissinghurst for the weekends and for our holidays. And my grandfather was widowed, Harold. His name was Harold. And we called him Hadji because that's what Vita used to call him. So he asked us to carry on that name. And he was in extreme grief. And, you know, in those days, people didn't really talk about it too much. It was, oh, he'll get over it, you know, get the funeral done and, you know, pack away the things and, you know, just keep him busy, keep him jolly, keep him going on. And he was absolutely poleaxed with grief. And at the age of 8, this experience of being in the presence of a man who was so broken was something obviously I'd never encountered before. And Adam and I discovered together that it was us with whom he could be more at ease, whether he wished to weep or even to laugh. He was huge fun with us. He was a fantastic grandpa. He had amazing stories. And he read to us, and he dared us to jump off top of walls, and he lit our sugar cigarettes with a real match, and he was amazing. But the thing was, he was mourning his wife. And I think that through that winter, it sounds rather pretentious, actually, and I'm kind of a bit hesitant to say it, but I think that what I learned is what compassion was, because his grief frightened his son, my father, and my mother. They didn't know what to do with it, whereas us children were far more accepting. If he wept, if he burst into tears, we'd just say, oh, you know, poor Hadji, you know, can we go and give you a banana sandwich? Or can we go for a walk? Or will you read us a story? And not sort of somehow or other, not to make a kind of drama of it. And so this sort of business of being loving to an adult was just something for a child that mattered to me. It mattered to me. I liked making him happier. It was amazing. So there was that. And then there was another thing that winter, which was that I was being taught English literature by the woman we called Mrs. Fitzgerald, who actually went on to become this famous novelist who won the Booker Prize, Penelope Fitzgerald. But when I was 8, she was my English teacher. And she would come into our classroom in London. She had holes in her shoes. She had no money at all. She was living on a houseboat in the Thames that was sinking. Well, we didn't know that. All we knew was that she was slightly mad, with a red bun in her hair, done up in a bun, sort of falling down, dripping in the snow, coming in the snow, and sitting on the desk and reading Tale of Two Cities to us. And I can, as I even speak it to you now, Nash, you've probably got some copies of that in the shelf behind you. The thrill of that storytelling, So, it was an impressionable winter for me. I had these adults in my life who were significant in one way or another. So it wasn't just snowballs and it just wasn't all snowmen and snowballs and skating at all. It was the recognition of grief. It was a sense of time passing with my grandmother dying. And it was the incredible excitement of the sound of this music that was coming down from Liverpool. And it was on the radio all the time as well. These were the Beatles singing "Love Me Do." How could you not?
You talked about how your language changed, coming home and saying groovy.
Yeah, that's right. And with it.
And with it.
And
absolutely.
Super.
Now, I have a couple of things to share from some of the audience. Ulrike thanks you for the fascinating memories and comments that bringing the details together makes so much, helps the history of 1963 fit together in a really important way for her. And Alison Sorley, I was in my mother's womb during that winter. I've always hated the cold.
Makes sense.
Wonder if there's a connection. And Diana and Peter Forbes, thank you so much for the question. They ask, what did you discover that surprised you the most?
I had never, I had never really known about Sylvia Plath, except that she'd been married to Ted Hughes and she had died. I never really knew about her. And Ted Hughes had left her, or their marriage had ended in 1962, and she'd moved into a flat in London in December 1962 with her two little children. And when I read her story, and I was writing her story in my book in real time during the weeks that this despair was overwhelming her, but simultaneously this astonishing creativity was filling her every spare moment when she wasn't looking after her children. And so as I approached the day of her death, which is actually three days from now, it's February the 11th, I was with her, and it was a very sort of almost out of body experience, actually, because I knew what was going to happen. And her correspondence had just been published, her amazing correspondence. I mean, gosh, I recommend it to anybody to have that book and just dip into it, because the letters are not just the sad ones. She's so funny. She's so descriptive. Her prose is as creative as her poetry. And I think what surprised me was that I was just almost able to kind of know her. It was a tremendous gift of writing something that I became so close to this woman who, decades and decades later was as real to me as she had been at that time. And so I suppose what surprised me was the intense privilege of being able to spend time thinking and writing and experiencing a particular time of life through the eyes of somebody else so vividly that I almost felt I was there myself.
That comes through the section of the book about her and her experiences is terribly moving. Even knowing a little bit about it, it personalizes it in a really kind of remarkable way. Now we've got
yeah,
please.
I was just going to say, when I was growing up, my dad, who was a historian, he always said to us two things. One is you need to know about the people. If you go to the Battle of Hastings, to the site where the battle took place, shut your eyes and try and imagine what it felt like to be Harold with the arrow going into his eye. It really hurt. Just try and imagine that. And then the other thing he said is, which I pass on to my granddaughter, is that its history is his story. It's his story. It's a story. You're telling a story. It's not just random things and sort of wars and treaties and things. It's a story. I tell Imogen, my granddaughter, that actually it is also her story. She thinks that's really cool.
That's I'd like to share, Ulrike, I remember the Lake Constance being frozen, a huge lake in the south of Germany, and are walking from the German bank of the lake to the Swiss one is an overwhelming moment. But now I can feel the threat that was present at those days due to the Cuban crisis. And Lois Pelicanos grew up in East Dean, and same age as Juliet, delighted that primary school in East Dean was closed as pipes had frozen, recalls making snow caves on the main road in the drift, queuing up at the milking parlor next to the village green with everyone else in the village, aiming for 2 pints of milk. East Dean cut off for 10 days. Now, we do have a request, and perhaps we'll fill it before our session is done for you to do a little reading. So if you'll prepare yourself for that. But Anna Crabtree asks, actually, I'll just read. Joanne and Stefan, thank you. I was a student in Liverpool, says Marion Dell, and we have a comment about remembering being a teenager in Liverpool and that it felt like the world belonged to the teenagers alone. And this comes through your book, that there was a real step change between the kind of Edwardian generation that still was in power and the power of the younger generation that was fighting against all those strictures.
Yes, I mean, if you were a teenager, you did not know war. You had been born at the end of the war or past that, and so you were. Your experience was not tainted by that, or indeed by the Spanish flu, might I say. So this was a generation who were determined to do things differently. It was a time for change. It was a moment for change. They did not have the baggage of the past. Their parents may have, their grandparents have, but they were free. What they were doing too was this aspirational country across the Atlantic. Yours, Nash, yours and Kate's. I
completely take credit for it. Absolutely.
You may. You know, we've spoken about JFK, but there was also Elvis, for heaven's sake. There was blue jeans, there were cars, there was washing machines. And, you know, if you were in Liverpool, and the Cunard line that regularly crossed between New York City and Liverpool, carrying passengers and cargo, carried a lot of these Liverpool lads who were working on the ships as waiters or cooks or whatever they were, luggage porters, so on, and would go across and come back with blue jeans and bootleg discs and so on. And so there was this kind of awareness, particularly in Liverpool itself, of a kind of neon world that was sort of almost within touching distance, because they were on the edge, Liverpool was on the edge, right on the Mersey there, with icebergs floating down it, but also these great ships going to and fro between New York and the Liverpool harbour. And so this sort of awareness was not London-centric, as so many things are, but it was there that this great kind of young energy and movement was happening and billowing, and where Harry Evans, the great newspaper reporter, was doing things about pollution, and it was up there, as well as, you know, Barry Humphries and his gang down south, who were moving and shaking and shifting the sort of tectonic plates beneath this frozen surface that was just beginning to erupt.
So some more questions coming in, and a couple of them in parallel. Will you be writing a weather and social history of the summer of 2020? Hot weather, COVID lockdown, Trump, Brexit, Black Lives Matter, quite a lot there, says Anna Crabtree. Thank you for that. And on a slightly different note, do you fancy writing a companion book about the summer of 1976?
Because it was very hot, the summer of 76. Of course, I remember it very well. I was doing my final university exams, and in love with T.S. Eliot as always. And it was absolutely boring. But I've sort of done a summer. I'm not quite sure what to do next, because kind of autumn and spring are a bit sort of fadey compared to. So I'm thinking.
Yeah, all right. We won't press you on that. But there is that sense which you are able to address in the book because of the way the current pandemic has unfolded, a kind of a sense of a parallel which is remarkable between the way people were trapped in the snow and the social changes that followed on, and the way we are in lockdown now, and many of us feeling a kind of pressure for social change, for political change. And I wonder whether you've been thinking about that, and if you have any sense of what we might be looking at over the next year.
Well, obviously, I didn't set out to have any parallels with, a frozen, paralyzed winter of nearly 60 years ago with where we are now. And the pandemic began as I was coming to the end of the writing of the book. So I finished actually writing the book sort of at the very end of last spring, when we were in lockdown. So it was impossible to ignore the parallels of loneliness, of feeling not able to reach people, not this time because of weather, but because of being stuck inside because of the virus. And yet, this was a year ago, and I obviously, or not quite a year ago, but 6 months or so ago. And I then at that stage, obviously we still don't know how long this situation is going to continue. But as I was thinking about it, above my head in Sussex, here above our heads in Alfriston, suddenly these skies that were emptying of aeroplanes were absolutely a kind of alive with birdsong. Extraordinary, joyful, rejoicing birdsong. And, wildlife and butterflies and caterpillars and hedgehogs and foxes and stuff just suddenly kind of invading our garden. And of course, in the news, there was the canals of Venice were suddenly running clear, and fish were suddenly swimming, and the first time in living memory. And so from nature's point of view, as everybody was remarking, last sort of March, April, May, nature was soaring and thriving. And it did make me think that not just on the sort of ecological perspective, but that perhaps sometimes it is a good thing. It's obviously not a good thing to have a war, a paralyzing winter, or a virus, all those terrible, terrible tragedies. But if you are forced to pause and to think as a society about the way you treat people, about how it might be to be lonely and cut off, how it might be to be in some way less advantaged than others, as they did in the 60s. My book is full of racial prejudice, sexual prejudice, class prejudice, every sort of prejudice. And 60 years later, these prejudices have not been solved, but they are being, as they were in that winter as well, aired. Oxygen is being brought into these issues. People are talking about them. And that is a start. That's a start. And so my optimism is cautious, but definite. It just as the skies are getting clearer, so are our feelings about what is wrong and what is right and what needs to be fixed.
Carol Norton asks an excellent question. I've heard you say in previous talks that you are not a historian. Do you still believe that?
Yeah, I do. I feel fraudulent to say I'm a historian. I mean, you know, I might be doing a conversation with Dan Snow next week. Totally terrifying because, you know, he knows it all. He really does. I am a storyteller of hopefully truths, things that really happened. But that's all I feel I am. And I love being that. I'm an English person. I love stories. And if there's stories set in the past that can illuminate the way people think and behaved and created, then what a lovely, lucky person I am to be able to tell those stories.
Well, you tell them remarkably well, and we're grateful to you for bringing them together. But I'm afraid, although that sounds like it should be the end, it's not really. We have, for instance, Lisa Dando asks, did you identify any unexpected parallels or synergies with The Perfect Summer?
I suppose that extremity can drive people to behave in extremity, and weather can drive people to behave in extreme ways. I'm not sure I want to go any further than that. I resisted writing about the winter because I didn't think it was going to be so sexy as the summer. I kind of, you know, I mean, the Edwardians didn't take their clothes off anyway, you know, but it wasn't, I don't mean sexy like that, but, you know, the sort of summer kind of feels more sort of joyous, but not necessarily, not if you are literally dying of heat. And the winter itself is a kind of extraordinarily beautiful and intimate season. And so I was wrong about that. I was wrong about to dismiss the winter, because the winter is just many, many, many wonderful things.
Yes, thank you for that observation. That is so true. I wonder, we're just going to wrap it up. I think you're prepared of a short reading from the book, and I'm just going to mention that Barry Humphries has said, you've reminded me of that white Boxing Day when I labored up Highgate Hill with snow up to my knees, and then asks, am I the BH in the dedication?
Barry,
you don't have to answer that.
Why didn't you tell me that story before, first of all? And second, you can be if you want to be, but you might have a little altercation with my husband, who is beloved. That's all I'll say.
All right. Well, you could sell tickets to the arm wrestling match that will follow. So would you, in closing, perhaps share a little passage from the book?
Well, I was only literally going to read, because I can see we're way over time. So I was literally just going to read one paragraph.
That would be wonderful.
And it's the paragraph when I was 8 and I woke up to the snow. So it's from the chapter which is called When Midnight's All a Glimmer. The day after Boxing Day, we woke to the peculiar blue light of reflected snow filtering through the closed curtains. Instead of disappearing during the night, as we had feared it might, the snow was still there, turning the landmarks of the garden, the walls, lawns, statues, urns, into something unrecognizable but unified. The sight was beautiful, its very transience on this familiar landscape making it even more precious. Snow muffled all sound, and the silence felt dream deep. Outside, freezing snowballs melted the second they hit the nape of our necks, and we tipped backwards onto the lawn, arms outstretched like acrobats, trusting that the mattress of snow would break our fall. Unlike a sandcastle on a beach, absorbed so soon by the waves, our imprints remained, hollows into which we could flop again and again. Down by the moat, where the naked statue of Dionysus was now clothed in a perfectly fitted white furry coat, we tested the water with the toe of a Wellington boot. Disappointingly, the surface, glinting under a weak sun, still moved beneath our feet, and the ducks still swam, not yet impeded by ice. But the cold felt as if it was getting colder by the minute. Tying a rope to an old abandoned wooden lavatory seat that we found in the back of a barn, we set about persuading any passing grown-up to swirl us round the lawn as we sat wedged into the oval hole, giddy with the novelty of it all. Out in the fields, the muddy furrows made by the plough in late summer had hardened into a pattern of miniature mountain ranges. The water in each tiny valley had frozen over, forming a sequence of minute iced-over ponds, delicious to jump on and crack. That's what we're going to be doing tomorrow. If
That's right. That's right. So the weatherman says. I'd like to, in closing, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us and for your patience with our technological challenges, difficulties, and limitations. But most of all, Juliet, I'd like to thank you. Thank you for the tremendous amount of work that this book took. Thank you for bringing it into our lives. Thank you for making us aware of all of the issues and doing it in such a way. It's such a pleasure, such a page-turning pleasure to read and learn and experience and sympathize. And we're deeply grateful for the chance to be able to share this moment with everybody. I'd like to suggest all of you, if you would think about unmuting.
Can I just say something before you do that unmute thing? Can I just say that on behalf of absolutely everybody in this village and in miles and miles around, thank you so much to Much Ado, to you and Kate Nash, because you are absolutely incredible the way you've kept going through this pandemic and supplying us with books and talks and communications and laughter and life and things to read. And honestly, we really applaud you, because
thank you for making us blush. We do appreciate it. But really, this evening is about you. And if all of you would perhaps take a moment and unmute yourselves, and perhaps just a little moment, a round of applause, a little thank you to Juliet. Juliet, congratulations. Yeah. We wish you every success with this book. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you. Absolutely wonderful to see you all. Really fabulous. And thank you, Nash.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to be ending this meeting now. I look forward to seeing you all gathered again another time, perhaps even in person someday, somewhere.